tonight we're going to be talking about bumblebees. As Simon says, if you have any questions, you have got a little chat icon on the bottom bar, for most of us on the bottom bar of the Zoom page, and that's where you can use that to pass any questions on to me. So bumblebees, I think that it's really difficult not to adore bumblebees because they're round, they're fuzzy, and when they're walking they waddle, and I think that's kind of the main points of being cute. So oops, I've lost my presentation now. Whoopsie daisy. So our bees in the UK, we've actually got around 250 species of bee here in the UK, but only 24 of these are bumblebees. We do have one species of honeybee, but all of the rest of our bees here in the UK are what we call solitary bees. So solitary bees are bees that don't have workers helping to raise the offspring. So the adults mate, the females make a nest where she lays the eggs, and she then leaves some food for developing offspring and seals it up. That's it, job done. So the young develop in the nest and emerge and carry out the same process as the year before. Our bumblebees, actually, sorry, in contrast, sort of the bumblebee will actually have a queen bee within that nest and have many workers helping her to raise that offspring. The one thing they do have in common is that they all rely on the pollen and nectar from our flowers to help fuel them and to help them to grow and to develop. These are just some of the bees that we have here in the UK. The top left one is the honeybee, which hopefully we all recognise. The rest are all solitary bees. So they're very different families of bees, so they'll look very different to each other. So as you say, sort of they've got sort of different shapes. They've got different. So if you look at the legs, they've got very different builds around them. They've got different colours, but also sort of size is varies hugely between different species. So we have bees which are less than the size of a pea, up to our larger bumblebees that you see around, which are massive in the bee world. So what is a bumblebee? This is typical bumblebee. So this is a Queen Bombus terrestris, or as we would more likely hear, the buff-tailed bumblebee. They are quite large and they're covered in thick hair and make a deep buzzing sound when they fly. Bumblebees belong to a group called Hymenoptera, which includes other species such as wasps, ants and sawflies. All of our bumblebees belong to a single group or genus, which is called Bombus, and there's about 250 species of bumblebee across the world. All bumblebees in the UK have an annual life cycle. So this means no bumblebee ever lives for more than a year. So only the queens live this long, and all of our workers and males die within a few months. All bumblebees feed only on pollen and nectar. So bumblebees have evolved a really special structure for collecting pollen. As you can see here, they've got that flattened leg there with lots of hairs fringing that. That's called a pollen basket, and that's been adapted in order to collect pollen in large clumps on these pollen baskets to bring them back to the nest. And bumblebees are mostly found in the northern hemisphere. So it's thought that they evolved in Himalayan regions, so it's not really a surprise that they're mostly found in cool temperate zones in the north. Like most bees, most insects, sorry, bumblebees are essentially cold-blooded. They do have a really interesting way of heating their bodies up. What they do is they vibrate their wing muscles without moving the wings. And this exercise heats their body up to over 30 degrees centigrade. This allows them to work early in the year, early in the morning, before the other bees are active. So that's a fantastic thing that really helps them out getting to that pollen and nectar before anything else does. The downside of that is that it requires a lot of energy. So they do require a bit more food for energy to be able to keep this up. When people and the media talk about the bee, there is a lot of reference to the honeybee, which can make things really confusing. So we're just going to quickly look at some of the main differences between honeybees and bumblebees. So these are some of the FAQs that we get at the Trust. So firstly, bumblebees are wild animals. So they don't really rely on us too much for care. They will feed from our flowers in our gardens or on our crops, but they could live quite happily without us. Honeybees, on the other hand, depend greatly on the efforts of our beekeepers to keep them alive. Beekeepers keep them in hives, they treat them with medicines and keep the hive clean. So the honeybees in the UK are domesticated, whereas our bumblebees will have workers who are actually doing that job, keeping the nest clean and tidy, and so keeping it free from disease. There are many, many more species of bumblebee. So in the UK alone, there are 24, but there is only one species of honeybee, sorry. There are different races of honeybee in different parts of Europe, but there is only one species. And there is a vast, vast difference in the colony size. So while bumblebees have a colony of around 50 to 400 workers, and that nest is generally about the size of a football, honeybees, as you'll see, are nesting in much, much bigger areas with generally a colossal up to 50,000 workers looking after that nest. And unfortunately, bumblebees haven't yet learned how to dance. So honeybees that have been gathering food can do a really intricate little dance. So they'll walk in loops and do certain moves, certain numbers of steps to tell other bees in the nest exactly where to find food. Bumblebees don't do that, but it is thought that they will waft their scents or pass on pollens and grains to let the other bumblebees know what flowers are in season at the time. And as mentioned, only the queen will survive the winter, and we'll talk more about the life cycle in a moment. But in the honeybee colony, the colony will survive through the winter. Again, because sort of they're being looked after differently, they've got a different life cycle. Bumblebees are struggling mostly because of flower shortages, whereas honeybees are struggling due to diseases such as the varroa mite and viral infections. So these can be treated by honeybee keepers, but often whole colonies will die off from these diseases once they get into a colony. So the bumblebee life cycle begins in early spring when the queen emerges from hibernation. So the queen spent all winter hibernating in the soil, and when she first emerged, she's going to be very, very low on energy. So the instant that she emerges, she's looking for nectar from early flowering plants such as willow catkins here. This nectar will give her the energy she needs to stay alive to start looking for a nest. When she's looking for a nest, she'll buzz above the ground, moving in a zigzag sort of pattern, and she'll look like she's looking for something, but that's because she is. So most of our bumblebees nest inside the ground. So they might be in abandoned rat or mouse nests. Others nest on the ground or in grassy tussocks. Some will nest in bird boxes. When the queen has found her nest, she starts to collect pollen. So in this image here, you should be able to see a large clump of of pollen on the basket there. So she brings this back to the nest and mixes it with wax. Wax is secreted by young bees. She mixes that wax to store it, and she also collects nectar, and she stores that in a pot similarly made from wax. This nectar she will use to keep herself alive while she broods the eggs. So she lays eggs on the pollen and wax mixture, and then she lies on them to keep them warm. So these tiny white eggs hatch quite quickly, and the grub-like larvae will eat the pollen and nectar she's collected. And it will take about 4 weeks of development for these larvae to turn into adult bees. The first brood are all female and all workers. So they've got different roles in the nest. Some are gathering more food from flowers. Some of them are actually looking after the next brood of offspring and generally keeping the nest clean and tidy. And as I said, sort of free from dirt and disease that could damage the colony. And eventually, if the nest is successful, it will have enough energy to produce new queens and males. So these are the only offspring that are able to reproduce. The new queens are made simply by feeding more larvae. So larvae much more food, which enables them to develop into queens. These queens then mate with males from different nests and then go into hibernation at the end of the summer. So all the old queens and the workers and the males will all die. And the queen then will dig a hole into the ground, usually a north-facing bank, and then she hibernates until springtime. Oops, wrong way. When the cycle just continues in that way. So what do bumblebees need? So with this entire life cycle, what they have required is somewhere to nest. They've needed somewhere to hibernate, somewhere nice and a little bit warmer over the winter. And they need lots of flowers for food, especially in those early days when they first emerge. It is lack of food that's causing our bumblebees to decline. So that's the aspect that we need to address most to help their populations. In 1980, an atlas of the distribution of bumblebee species was created. This is where in the country each species was found. So it was found that compared to 1900, over a third of each social bumblebee species had declined in their range by more than 70% across the UK. Some of these declines have been really dramatic, and there's a few examples of these. So this is the great yellow bumblebee, which was originally found throughout the UK, south of England, right up to the north of Scotland. By the middle of the 20th century, it declined dramatically in England and Wales, and is now only found on the north coast and the western Isles of Scotland. It thrives there on the Maca habitat, which is really rich in wildflowers like red clover. The shrill-carded bee, again, originally found out throughout much of England and Wales, right up to northern England. But by the middle of the 21st century, had declined to much of its, by middle of the 21st century, declined greatly and is now only found in about 7 populations in South Wales and England. You'll notice all these populations are quite far apart, so that means they can't interbreed. This is particularly dangerous because interbreeding can result in genetic diseases within those bee colonies. And our final example is our saddest so far. So this is the short-haired bumblebee. Originally had a fairly good range throughout England and Wales, although again by the middle of the, this is jumping ahead a little bit. Sorry about that. By the middle of the century had experienced quite an alarming decline, and then in the 1980s was declared extinct in the UK. which does go to show what could happen to other species of bumblebee in the UK, some of which are now dangerously close to extinction. The Trust is, however, part of a project with Natural England and RSPB, which is attempting to reintroduce the short-haired bumblebee to the UK. The project has been running since 2009 and has been working with farmers and conservation groups to create flower-rich habitat and to release in the area of Dungeness and Romney Marsh, where it was last found in the UK. So in May 2012, about 100 queens of this species were taken from a site in Sweden where they thrive and brought to the UK. They were screened for disease and then released at an RSPB reserve in Dungeness. So monitoring over the 10 years of the project showed that several species of rare bumblebees had increased as a result of the project's interventions. On nature reserves, rare bumblebees have increased 8-fold with the advice, planting, habitat management, and away from the reserves where the advice alone is more common, rare bumblebees have increased 3-fold, which is quite a significant achievement in just 10 years. So 5 releases took place between 2012 and 2016, with a number of short-haired bumblebee workers having been recorded. But at the moment, we don't know enough about their genetic diversity to ascertain whether there is a viable self-sustainable population being established. So monitoring and genetic testing is taking part in phase 2 of the project. And if you take a look at the website, you can find a lot more about the project and what's been happening there. However, even the species whose range doesn't appear to be declining could be experiencing declines, but we don't know because in the past we've only looked at where bees are present. What we do need to know is how is the abundance of those species in any one area. So through our bee walk survey, volunteers are actually out there recording the number of each bee found in their area, which is being built up to increase our data in how the populations are changing over time. And it's a great opportunity to get involved in data collection and of course to get you out on a walk and looking at nature once a month. And you can find plenty of information about getting involved on the website. You just search for Bee Walk, it will take you to the website. So why should we be worried about the decline of bumblebees? In commercial terms, they're extremely important pollinators and contribute a huge amount to our economy. So even back in 1996, it was thought that insect pollination was worth around £440 million to the UK and 14.2 billion euros to the wider Europe area. So as well as this commercial benefit, sorry about that, as well as this commercial benefit, many of our wild plants depend on bumblebees for pollination. As the bees visit the plants for food, they carry pollen from one plant to another. And this pollination allows plants to make seeds and reproduce. So if bumblebees and other insect pollinators weren't around to pollinate these plants, many wouldn't be able to reproduce and they would die off. This would have huge complications and implications for other animals that depend on these plants. So we can easily see how bumblebees are a really, really important aspect of the food chain. And of course, there's also the intrinsic value of the bumblebee. They deserve to be conserved for their own value, irrespective of the monetary value that's associated to them. And how different would our own lives look? How different would our plates look if we didn't have bumblebees? pollinating. These are just some of the crops that are actually dependent on bumblebees for pollination. So including raspberries, tomatoes, oilseed, peas, beans, apples, and loads and loads of more soft fruits. So you can see sort of it's going to have quite an impact on our own diets there as well. So this slide here just illustrates that honeybees, although they are pollinators, they're all the same size, all have the same length of tongue, and they do therefore sort of visit a wide range of crops and wildflowers. Bumblebees, however, come in a range of size and shapes. Even within each species, there's a lot of variation in the size of workers. What this means is that bumblebees pollinate a much broader range of crops and wildflowers. Now, ideally, both would work together to deliver pollination services, but in the face of declining honeybee populations, bumblebees could and should be there as our wild insurance policy. This will only sort of be a small premium, but if we manage the land in a sympathetic way, then we can provide everything that our bumblebees need in order to help to support our range of wildlife, our range of plants and our food crops. Bumblebees declining mostly because of changes to their habitat. So since the 1940s, we have lost over 98% of our flower-rich grasslands. So this has been because of changes to agriculture, which has meant we can produce more food, but has made the countryside less useful for wildlife. Consequently, we've seen the landscape change from areas covered in wildflowers to one that's covered in vast monocultures of grassy fields without much food for bumblebees at all. Bumblebees can't eat grass, so this land is mostly useless to them. So what can we do? The best thing we can do for them is to provide flower-rich habitats for them to feed. The best habitats look like this. So this is Maca. This is on the Scottish Islands, and as you can see, it's really rich in wildflowers, especially red clover. It's a bit of a superfood for our bumblebees because it's really high in the amino acids and nutrients that are best for them. Other great habitats look like this. This is chalk grasslands. Again, really high in wildflowers such as knapweed. So that's kidney vetch. Obviously, again, sort of really important for the small blue butterfly. Red clover, as we just mentioned, and knapweed. And BBCT also work directly with farmers and land managers to help them to move in the right direction. Because again, as we said, sort of having that area for our pollinators is greatly useful for a wide range of crops as well. So the support goes both ways. And this is particularly important in areas around remnant populations of some of our rarest species. So there's some targeted work to increase the amount of habitat there. So the work takes place to encourage farmers and landowners to get involved and to provide that management which is supportive of a range of wildlife, and again sort of helping them to make sure that they're not making a financial loss, but helping them to opt into agri-environment schemes. So this is an example of practical land management in action. So this was a joint venture between the Bumblebee Conservation Trust and the RSPB. At the reserve at Loch Leven, we created a wildflower meadow in an area that was previously flower poor grass. And in the first year, are having been reseeded with local wildflower seeds. We helped create a wildflower meadow with a fantastic display of annuals. So that's done in the first instance in order to support the perennials to become stronger as they come through. And it's now settled into being a flower-rich grassland. So this is the what we call the bilberry bumblebee, or the bladeberry bumblebee in Scotland. So it's absolutely crucial to have access to this sort of land. And without these sorts of projects and this sort of land management taking place, then these bumblebees would struggle to survive. But patches like this here and there, helping them to reach larger areas, can really help them to survive. So as you see, we've got numbers of small patches. So as I mentioned earlier, the bee will need a huge amount of energy to be able to keep itself warm as it moves from one area to another. So where we have small patches which actually break up the gaps in between large areas of habitat, these bees can actually visit these areas to keep them going on to the next one. They provide food for huge numbers of nests, and they can travel from up to 1 kilometre away to get to these patches to give them energy to keep on moving. We're really keen on gardening for bumblebees, and that's a huge area of gardens which cover the UK, which even if sort of just a few of us were out there putting some wildflowers and some pollen-rich flowers into our gardens, then we could create some fantastic stop gaps for those bees as they're traveling from one habitat to another. In fact, it's to the point where actually some of our bumblebee species are actually more common in our gardens and in our parks than they are in the countryside, with a combination of us providing more food for them and a loss of habitat in the countryside for them. We've got more than 1 million hectares of garden in the UK, which gives us an opportunity to actually make sure we are planting across the seasons. So those early pollinators, as we mentioned, are really important. Without those early pollinators, right from February, when things are starting to emerge, and importantly in March, it's really important that our bumblebees can actually get out and get that pollen and nectar. So those catkins in spring, helping them to support the colony through early summer, and of course in the mating period in late summer, before they start winding down, and the queens will be going into hibernation. So there's a huge number of plants that are no good for bumblebees or any other wildlife, in fact. So a lot of the plants that are available to buy produce very little pollen or nectar. Others have really complicated flowers, too many petals, or structures which block access to the food from the bumblebees. These plants have often been bred by horticulturists because they look nice, but they don't actually offer anything other than looking pretty. These are things like sort of pansies, begonias, primroses, and petunias. So as the colony grows, bees have to collect more and more food for growing larvae. So when we're looking at planting, we want to plant some of the best things we can in spring when the queen emerges from hibernation. So here's some of the things that they might like to visit during that time. So when you're planning your spring garden, here's some of the things that you might like to think about. planting. So it's because it's essential there's plenty of food available, otherwise the nest won't ever establish. So as I said, the colony grows through spring and summer. And here are so this is some of the things that we might like to have, which are going to be flowering during that time for them to eat on. The things like our onions and our peas. Foxgloves are beautiful plants, and they're really good for our species with longer tongues. So our bees will actually sit at the point where the flower starts to become too narrow, and then their tongue, which is wound up inside their heads, so it's a straw, basically a straw, which one is curled up inside their heads. They will use that to extract the nectar from the flower. However, there is also nectar robbing. So some of the ones which with shorter tongues, those that can't reach it, will actually eat a hole in the bottom of that flower and then just crawl up and take that nectar. So they all find their way. Mid to late summer, so this is when we're fledging both new queens and the males. So this requires a lot of food. As we mentioned before, the queen requires additional food in order to help her to develop into a queen. So our lavenders, our honeysuckles, as we said, clovers are that superfood. These are some of the really, really important foods, including lots of herbs, which are fantastic both for us and for the bumblebees. So we do have the Be Kind little test on our website, so you can actually sort of find out a little bit more about some of those plants and help you to identify sort of how well you're looking after your garden for our little pollinating buzzy friends. So this will also sort of help you to give you a little bit of a rating on your garden. We're also really keen for people to get involved in making space in their local areas to be bee friendly. So we've got lots of these amenity and park areas, which can be fantastic for wildlife. Things like community planting, tree planting projects. So things like our orchard trees are really, really fantastic for our bees. So these could be great places to pop those, and are really pretty for the community. Our orchard trees are also providing fruit that people can take. And those wildflower areas, as it says here, will flower year after year if managed properly. And as with the wildflower meadow projects, it can be a really good idea to plant some annuals in the first instance, just that first flush of colour, so it looks really nice for the community while those perennials are coming into force. And you can download Making Space for Bumblebees from the website. There are surveys you can get involved with, such as our Bee Walk. So this is, again, it's a national scheme, and it takes place every month in an area of your choice. So you will go out and carry out a walk that you've devised that you know is accessible for you, and you will count the bumblebees on your transect there. This will help us to detect the numbers within each population, so we can see how that abundance changes over time. The route should be between 1 and 2 kilometres. Some are a little bit longer, some are a little bit shorter, and they take place during bumblebee season, of course, from March to October. And we record all of the bumblebee species we've seen and the number of bumblebees within each of those species. Our Bee Watch, so this is simply photographing bumblebees you see and sending them to us. You don't have to be able to identify them, so those photos will get sent to us and we'll identify that. what we really want to see is more habitat for our bumblebees in your garden. We want to increase the availability on farmland, so looking at that sympathetic management, so and other landowners as well. So if you are a landowner or know a landowner or farmer, then you can come to us and get some advice on how you can do that. Taking part in some of those surveys, as we just mentioned, and volunteering. At the moment, our face-to-face volunteering is not happening for what I hope are obvious reasons, but you can help by helping us to give presentations, simply by talking to other people, posting on social media for people to get involved, and then of course once the restrictions hopefully soon are lifted, then we'll be getting back to some more of that face-to-face volunteering, where you can join us at events and activities and carry out your own, carry out bee walks, guided walks with people to show them the bumblebees and to get them interested and support them on their journey to conserving our bumblebees. And of course you can join us. So we'd love to see you as members of Bumblebee Conservation Trust. We've got a wide range of membership types. Our new members will get a choice of ID help. So we've got an ID guide, a little fold out ID guide, or a post-it you can put on your wall, and some support for making space for bumblebees in your own garden. Bumblebees really need our help, so we're asking you to join us to save the sound of summer. If you can do anything at all to make space for pollinators in your garden, on your allotment, on your balcony, or even if you've only got a window box, just a few pollen-rich flowers in there will help our bumblebees. And you can enjoy those flowers and enjoy the bumblebees and know that you've helped to make a difference. And if there are any questions now, that's our...
Brilliant. Thank you, Debs. That's excellent. John.
Stumbling over words.
Unless my machine has broken down, I haven't got any questions at the moment. Oh, yeah. Here we go. Here's the first one. If you find a bumblebee covered in mites, is it kinder to kill it along with the mites, or is it not suffering and therefore leave it alone? I've come across bees that look like they're really struggling under the weight of the mites. So do you leave them alone, or do you put them out of their misery?
That's a really good question. Now, I've dealt with this where a bumblebee's got one or two mites. You can see mites, and they're generally harmless because they're pretty much, they're not doing any damage to the bumblebee on the whole by being there. Pretty much they're catching a lift somewhere else. Yes, you raised the point that you've sort of seen them really struggling with them. I'm afraid what I'm going to have to do is go away and find out and come back to you on that one. So I'm going to make a note of that one.
Okay. With reports of bee eaters travelling across the channel, how big a concern is this?
So could you repeat the question for me?
Yeah, so with reports of bee eaters, the birds, travelling across the channel, how big a concern is this? Okay. Another predator.
Yeah, okay. So our predation of bees is not a huge issue. The habitat is the main issue for them. So every year for a long time we've had a number of bee eaters. Sorry, not every year, but for a large number of years we've had bee eaters travelling to the UK. They're generally small numbers, one or two, and very rarely do we get anything like bee eaters actually being able to breed in this country. We've had some attempted nestings in which have been looked after by some sort of low-key projects within conservation organisations, helping helping to look after them. But at this moment in time, we're not getting numbers that would provide any real risk to them.
Okay, so not at this point. Yeah. If you find a bumblebee looking weak and staggering around the garden, would you feed it? And if you did, what on?
Okay, personally, yes, I would, because I'm pretty soft. So it could be that this bumblebee is actually reaching the end of its lifespan, or it could actually be just it's really cold and really struggling. So what I would do is just some sugar water. We don't ever give bumblebees honey, because it's not a natural substance to them and it is toxic to them.
Right.
But some sugar in water, and then help them to keep a little bit warm.
Yeah.
Then watch them fly off.
Right. Okay. Sugared water. Okay. How do bumblebees identify mouse holes for prospective nests? So.
Okay, so it's rather than sort of identifying them as that, I imagine, is I don't want to anthropomorphize animals any more than necessary, but what they're actually doing is they're looking for holes. So they'll as the queen goes out, and she'll be zigzagging up and down, and looking over the habitat for anything that looks suitable. So it just so happens that the holes are about the right size that might signify to her that this is going to be useful, would tend to be rat or mouse holes, rather than them actually wanting it to be a rat or a mouse hole.
Okay. Are bumblebees predated by wasps like honeybees are?
That's a very good question. We have wasps that eat a wide range of other invertebrates, so I can imagine that some would be. Again, I will have to find out.
Okay. Okay. Are there any nocturnal bumblebees?
Gosh, I've never heard that question. So no, so bumblebees do require warmth to be able to move. So whilst in the summer we'll see them out much later. Once it's dark, we don't really get bumblebees. So obviously we do across the country. Lots of things like moth trapping and stuff takes place at night. I've not heard any reports of bumblebees being brought in during any night
moth trap,
if anything. So I can't say that definitely there's never been any out overnight. It's not standard. Okay.
What's the range of a bumblebee? If you find one in the garden, is it likely to be a resident there or nearby, or is it likely to come from far and wide?
Different bumblebees will have different ranges.
Yeah.
So again, our bumblebees, as with any bees, will have, we've got really small bees. So our early bumblebee, really quite tiny, right up to our Bombus terrestris, and the great yellow bumblebee over on the Hebrides. So the larger a bumblebee, the more heat it can retain. The more heat it requires, but more heat it can retain to be able to fly a longer period. So, longer range. So as I said, sort of your average range to get to the next food supply is around 1 kilometre.
Yeah.
So if they're getting large amounts of food, they can go further. Food less. But yes, they could have travelled over 1 kilometre to get to your garden.
Okay, that's interesting. One from me. Last summer, one morning I looked in the garden, and in the bed in one of the flower beds, there was a large hole that had been dug, and in the bottom of the hole were some very sort of drunken and punch drunk bumblebees. And I was reliably informed that a badger had dug down and taken out the nest. Is that common? Is this a common thing? And what are the badgers after?
The bumblebees.
The bees? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, basically, they found they found an obvious nest. So, as I say, sort of it can often resemble a mouse or rat nest. So they find a hole and they go digging for food. They may well not have been expecting to find bumblebees there, but they were whatever was in that nest. Yeah, it's not uncommon. It's quite a common way for them to find food. Fantastic diggers are our badgers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
made a mess of our flower bed anyway.
Yes, yeah.
And the bee's nest.
You need to find some way to direct them more, to maybe making some little holes in the areas that you really can't be bothered to dig over, and direct them over there to
somewhere else. Diversionary tactic. Okay. Are neonicotinoids a proven risk to bumblebees?
Yes. So neonicotinoids are used to treat flower seeds. So a lot of the plants and seeds that you find in our garden centres would have been treated with this. So neonicotinoids can actually create sort of neurological issues, which will mean that our bumblebees are not able to carry out their usual processes. So they don't know where they're going, what they're doing. They can't eat or bring food back to the nest. So yes, if these are widely used in an area that's a main food source for one or more nests, it will cause that entire nest to fail completely. They are a real problem for individuals and therefore for colonies. Abundance of our bumblebees. Yeah. Okay.
Can you tell us again how?
So sorry. So please, if you can look for seeds and plants that aren't treated with neonicotinoids. You can count things like sort of B&Q made a commitment to not using them. So yeah, it's a quick Google search might help.
Okay. Can you tell us again how to identify whether a specific plant is good for bumblebees?
Yes, so if you take a look on the website, there's the Be Kind app. It's not just an app, it's on the website. You can carry it out on the website, and that will take you through a large number of species. And our pages on gardening for bumblebees are really useful. There are things, however, so we have a species of bumblebee, the Bombus terrestris, actually overwinters. So they are they're the bumblebee that has a third season. And of course, most of our wildflowers aren't flowering there. So actually some of the non-native plants, such as hebes, if you look at hebes in winter, if you see or hear a bee, that's going to be a buff-tailed bumblebee. So things like that can be really, really useful for overwintering Bombus terrestris.
Okay. Just for information, 38 Degrees are currently offering packets of PeaFriendly Seeds that you can order. Be sure not sure about the details, but I had an email yesterday. So that's 38 Degrees, which has a website as well. So I'm sure everybody could find that on the website.
Absolutely. There is a map. I'll just share this with you. I created this with Wild Ideas, and you can find it at seeds.wildideas.org.uk. And it's all of the pollinator friendly seeds and plants that I could find through a search. We're building on it all the time, but these are So we've got organic and peat-free ones, which are great, but our organic plants will not have been treated with any neonicotinoids, but that might be a useful resource for you.
Okay, that's very useful. I think that's all the questions that we've had through. So yeah, thanks very much, Debs. Thanks for that. Over to you, Simon.
Sorry, I went away and found out about the wasp.
Oh right.
Oh yeah.
So with predation, the issue isn't necessarily the eating of them, but actually it's those parasitic wasps which might lay their eggs inside our live bumblebees or in bumblebee nests, in the same way that the cuckoo bees would do.
Gotcha.
So yeah, they do suffer from predation, but not necessarily just eating.
Well, they're not like the mobs of wasps that will knock out a whole beehive.
No.
With a battle royal at the front door. Debs, thank you so much. A very, very interesting talk, and certainly I've learned an awful lot about bumblebees there. They are, as you say, delightful and fascinating, and there's obviously lots we can all do to encourage their survival. And obviously we'd join with you in urging people to think about gardening appropriately and joining the Bumblebee Conservation Trust and thinking about their neonicotinoid coated seeds and maybe being a bit more careful about where they buy them. So all these things will help. But anyway, super. Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate that. Thank you to everybody who turned up today to listen. And I'll remind you that our next talk is also on the 16th of the month about Wembury. We look forward to seeing you all then. So thank you very much and good evening to you.
Thank you.